Hey, this is Jamey with Stonemaier Games, and today's video is going to be pretty big. And I want to say up front that I'm going to talk about a lot of different combat mechanisms of games that aren't in my top 10 first, and then I'll jump to my top 10. I'll start talking about my top 10. If you want to jump right to the top 10, Joe is going to post right here somewhere on the screen a timestamp or a rough timestamp that you can now jump to if you want to go to the top 10 and then come back to learn about all these other games, all these different mechanisms, and my thoughts on combat mechanisms. So I'm going to do the discussion first and end with the top 10 versus what I usually do, just to try to mix things up. Feel free to give me your feedback about that order of operations in the comments below. So this is a big topic, so I'm going to jump all around. But basically, I am currently designing two games. One is a cooperative game, and one is a competitive game. And both have the potential, both are probably likely to have combat mechanisms in them. And so I've been thinking about it a lot lately, both in terms of playing against, having a combat mechanism against the AI versus another player or even other players, plural. So I've been thinking about it a lot lately. That's why I'm talking about it today. That said, this isn't a mechanism, or these aren't mechanisms that or the style of games that I typically gravitate towards. And so I have very few visual examples. Joe's going to put some up for the top 10, but for all the other games, we're not going to do visuals, and I don't have examples to show you. Although some I could grab. I'll let you know the games that I actually own on the list. I'll also mention up front, and I'll come back to this as I talk about games, but the types of things that I look for in a combat mechanism that I really like are low spite. So a mechanism where, especially in a multiplayer game, where you can't just pick on one player, or where the game heavily incentivizes you not to pick on one player. In fact, as I'm saying this, I realize that I forgot to put a game on this list, so I'm going to add one here. So the game that I'm writing down specifically does that, or has you not pick on one player. I also like combat mechanisms that are fast, that don't take a lot of time. Especially in a multiplayer game. In a dueling game, that's a little bit different, but in a multiplayer game where you can kind of breeze through it. I have an example of a game that I'll mention later where combat takes a long time, and it's actually pretty cool, but it just takes a long time. I also like combat mechanisms where agency is very high, where players have a lot of control. They have a lot of information going into combat. Maybe there's a little bit of luck, a little bit of variation, some unknown information, but players have a lot of control over why they might enter combat and what they're going to get out of it. Last, I always really like combat mechanisms where the stakes are high, but you also have the ability to recover from it. One of my favorite games that I'll mention in the top 10 has a great example of this, a way to recover from combat. So let me jump right in. I'll start with our games that feature some combat. The first is Scythe. Scythe is the first game that I published, that I designed, that has combat in it. And it was by far the most difficult aspect of the game to design. I went through over 20 different iterations of combat, trying to balance things like how do I make combat worth it so a player will attack someone else, but at the same time, that the defender has a reason to fight back, but not so big of a reason that the attacker then doesn't have a reason to attack in the first place. Again, I wanted both players to be able to recover from combat inside, and I wanted players to have a lot of information. I started with a lot of dice rolling mechanisms in Scythe combat, and I moved away from them, ended up with no dice in the combat mechanisms, because I wanted players to have a lot of control over the outcome. It's not deterministic. You might hear that term thrown around a lot with tabletop games, deterministic combat. That's when there's nothing happening during combat at all. You're just comparing two numbers that you enter, that you know entering combat. You know the outcome before you even enter combat. Whereas in Scythe, you have a combat dial. You are spending power, which is the resource that you're spending in combat, secretly on the dial. And you're also, for every unit in combat, every combat unit, you have the potential, if you want to hide a combat card behind the dial, and then you reveal it and show the total. And attackers also win ties in Scythe. That was a little different, somewhat controversial, because I think in many games the defender wins ties. But in my opinion, again, it was part of that balance of giving attackers a reason to actually attack. Gives them a slight edge there. And also, in my opinion, thematically, I think attackers thematically generally have the advantage, as long as the defender isn't prepared for it. So in some games thematically, the defender might fully know when combat is about to happen, and they can prepare for it, and then they do have the advantage. But if the attacker is kind of surprising the defender, then I think the attacker has a huge advantage, and they should break ties in combat. So that's why I had attackers break ties in Scythe. Another game that we have is My Little Scythe. My Little Scythe has pie fights that are also very much inspired by Scythe. There's a dial, you're spending magic spells instead of combat cards, and the one little twist to My Little Scythe is that you can only earn, and this is actually in Scythe too, there's a reason to have you not just go on a rampage throughout the world, which is that in My Little Scythe you can only earn one victory point, essentially, one trophy from winning combat. So you can't just spend the whole game attacking. You could, but you'll only earn 1 star, and you're spending that power resource throughout each combat. So you're depleting your ability to even win combat. Same with Scythe. You can only get 2 stars in Scythe from winning combat. Again, a reason to not just spend the whole game attacking. The other thing in My Little Scythe is if your friendship level is too low, it's another thing that you have to monitor in the game, something that you can build up and get rewarded for it. But if it's too low and you win combat, you don't win anything at all. You don't get a trophy. You win the combat, but you don't get a trophy. Also in My Little Scythe, I really like this recovery mechanism where if you lose combat, you're taken back to your home base. Same thing in Scythe, you're taken back to your home base, so you're not actually, no one is killed, you're just kind of forced to retreat. And in My Little Scythe, you get a recovery bonus for whenever you end up at your home base. And for Scythe as well, if you put up any sort of a fight in combat, this is a reason to give defenders a reason to at least fight back a little bit and to put attackers on edge. If you fight back even a little bit, you get a combat card at the end of combat. The last game that I published with combat, and I'll try to speed this up, obviously this is going to be a longer video today, but is Tapestry. Tapestry doesn't have a very involved combat. Basically, when you conquer, the opponent only has the option of playing a trap card. And if they do, then they actually then the conquer isn't successful, basically, and you still put an outpost there on the territory, but the player who played the trap, their outpost remains upright, giving them still control of the territory. So there's always a little bit of uncertainty there in terms of who's going to win combat, even though in general, when you try to conquer a territory controlled by someone else in Tapestry, in general, you are going to succeed in that combat, and you always get rewarded. You're still going to roll the conquer dice, even if you aren't successful in conquering the territory, and get a bonus from it. And I'm excited in the Tapestry expansion that I've been working on. There are some new elements to combat that don't make it any more involved. It's just as streamlined as it already is, but there's a number of twists, a number of other things to consider and think about, some surprises that can happen if you try to conquer an opponent's territory. Anyway, let's move on from my games. That took longer than I thought, so I'll definitely try to speed this up a bit. The next category I wanted to talk about are digital games, very briefly. I have a video about Void Tyrant, which has a kind of a push your luck mechanism with combat. I haven't played Slay the Spire, but I've heard it's a delightful deck building game that uses where you're pretty much just fighting through an ongoing stream of different monsters that have really high life totals that you have to fight off. Regalia is a game that I'm currently playing with Megan, and Megan is handling most of it because in Regalia the combat is a huge part of the game. I'm interested in like the choose your own adventure part of the game. The combat can take a long time. I've seen Megan get in combats that last like 20 minutes where you're fighting just a few people, and it looks really cool. And the thing that I actually really like about it, despite the length, is that there are these abilities that power up the longer that you survive in combat. So I think that's pretty cool that if you have like these very powerful abilities that just take time to power up. You know you're going to get to use them eventually if you survive, but they just take time. I think that's really cool. There's Heroes of Might and Magic 2, I think, is the one that I played way back in the day. And I might be remembering this completely incorrectly, but the thing that I really loved about it is basically the opposite of Regalia. What I recall is that in Heroes of Might and Magic, you can kind of set out all of the different units and you kind of position them on the battlefield, and then you just press play and let them fight. And that part happens really quickly. So it's all set up and then automation. So it speeds it up a ton. You're not actually controlling units one by one over the course of 15 to 20 minutes. I might be totally remembering that incorrectly, but if that's what it was, I really like that. I really like how combat is sped up in that way, but you still have a lot of agency going into it. And then you get to kind of sit back and watch this battle unfold in front of you. Dark Souls is one where I've heard great things about the combat in Dark Souls. It's basically, from what I've heard, you're fighting very difficult bosses, very, very difficult. But when you learn their patterns and you increase your power level, you have a much better chance of defeating those monsters. And I've heard it's very satisfying to have these very powerful monsters, these very difficult battles, to fight and fight and fight and finally figure it out. And last is Super Hot. I've heard really cool things about the combat in Super Hot, which is basically, from my understanding, that the enemies only move when you choose to move. So it's kind of real time. Well, it's not really even real time combat, because as you choose to if you choose to move over here to dodge or improve your line of sight, that's when your opponents can move. But if you're not moving, they stay perfectly still. So you can kind of really think through every move. It's more of a puzzle than a dexterity button mashing experience in Super Hot. Those are digital games. Let's move on to tabletop games, which is the main focus of this video. And first I'll talk about games where you're fighting against the AI. And until I get to the top 10, even in these different categories, I'm not going to mention the games that ended up in the top 10. So games that have combat versus the AI, Gloomhaven is probably the elephant in the room here. Number one game in the world, according to Board Game Geek. And Gloomhaven has a combat mechanism where you're choosing two cards from your hand. You're choosing the top of one of them and the bottom of one of them. And each card also has like a default element to it, where you can just choose the default instead of the special ability. Every character in the game has their own special deck of cards, so their combat abilities feel very different than other players. Very, very cool. Card-driven combat mechanism. There's a big focus on initiative in the game, in what order you are going to act versus the other players and versus the monsters that you're fighting. So pretty cool combat mechanism there. One that I haven't played is Tainted Grail, but I want to. The combat mechanism in Tainted Grail sounds really cool, where you're playing some cards and trying to match up icons, a series of icons and numbers, I believe, from what I've seen. You can maybe comment more on that in the comments below. That sounds really cool. Two that I have played, again, versus the AI. One is Kingsburg, which I almost didn't put on this list, but it occurred to me that it is kind of a combat against the AI. The combat itself is very simple. You're just comparing two numbers. But what I really like about the combat in Kingsburg, and actually the next game that I'll mention as well, is that you don't know what you're fighting unless you go out of your way to learn what the invader is. And so I like that choice. And the same with the next game I'm going to mention is Legendary Encounters Alien. I like that idea that combat itself is very simple, just comparing two numbers, but it's kind of the element of the unknown that is in play, that gives players an interesting decision. Do you decide to, as this invader is coming, as this alien is creeping through the spaceship in Legendary Encounters, do you take your time to actually see what they are and see what you're about to fight and prepare for it? Or do you just kind of hedge your bets and hope that you're okay? I really like that uncertainty decision in both Kingsburg and Legendary Encounters Alien. So that's combat in games where you're playing against the AI. Let's move on to dueling games. So this could have been a whole list of dueling games, because there are plenty of games where you're fighting back and forth, two players. I'm sure I've left plenty off this list. I didn't even put Keyforge on this list. I didn't mention Hearthstone. But I did mention Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering is one that I think has inspired dueling mechanisms in a ton of games, where each creature has an attack strength and a defense number. So two numbers where you're dealing damage. There's a ton that goes into the combat of Magic. It's a huge part of the game. Seven Wonders Duel. Combat isn't a huge part of this game, but military itself plays a huge role in Seven Wonders Duel. It uses a tug-of-war style track where as you advance on the track, as you claim military cards and move in one direction along that track, you A, get closer to an outright military victory, and B, you force your opponent to lose coins. So even if you don't push that all the way to a military victory, you are making your opponent spend money and forcing them to not do other things that they want to do with that money. And you're also kind of, if you decide to go military in Seven Wonders Duel, you're making your opponent think about that too. You're making them think a little bit about taking some military so you can't push all the way to the end of the track. Stratego. Stratego is actually a game that I own and love. It's one of my favorite two-player games. The combat in Stratego is simply, for the most part, you have these little units that are facing you. You can see what all your units are, but you don't know what your opponent has. And the lower the number, the better. So the number one unit, there's only one number one unit, can beat pretty much anything on the board if they attack that unit. They can't beat bombs, and if a spy attacks the number one, the spy wins. But it's this very simple system of the lower the number, the better. But it's just a fun, again, a level of uncertainty. You know what you have, but you have no idea what your opponent has until they start moving their pieces around, and then you might have a clue. Or you might say that they're not moving this piece, and is it a bomb? Are they bluffing that it's a bomb? You don't really know. So I like that element of combat in Stratego. Reminds me a little bit, actually, of Captain Sonar. Captain Sonar uses the battleship mechanism, where you are trying to sink the opponent's ship, but you don't know where it is. And so you're using various missiles. You get to choose the type of missile that you charge up and then launch to deal damage to a big area, a small area, specific target. But you don't know if you're going to hit anything at all. And I think that's pretty cool in Captain Sonar. It adds a lot of fun and tension to the game, especially when you just have an outright miss or an unexpected hit. Star Realms. Star Realms combat is it's a deck building game, two-player dueling game, and the thing I really like actually about combat in Star Realms, well, two things. One, from the first turn of the game, the first few turns of the games, you are already dealing some damage to your opponent. Life in this game is how you win or lose. But I also really like that there are certain ships that you can build that stay on the board, and you must attack them first. You can't, they kind of serve as a big shield for you if you build them, that the opponent must attack them first. And there are other ships that are may attack. So you may choose to attack this ship or the opponent. And if you leave that ship out there, it's going to be it has generally a very powerful ability that opponent is getting every turn instead. So that's an interesting level of decision there. The ability to kind of put a big shield out to protect yourself, or a possible shield that leaves the choice in the hand of your opponent. And Skulk Hollow. Skulk Hollow is one other one that I do have on my shelf over there, where it's an asymmetric two-player dueling game. One player has a lot of different units that they're controlling. Another player has one big unit that they control. And I really like the big unit. It's a kind of a big monster. And the player with all the small units kind of send their units, they climb onto the monster and deal damage to different parts. And as they deal damage to different parts, the player who controls the monster can no longer use abilities associated with those parts. I think that's really cool. I'd love to see that in a game where the monster is controlled by the AI. Because it doesn't feel great as the player who is the monster to get weaker and weaker. But if you're playing against an AI and that monster is controlled by an AI, I think that would be awesome, because you don't feel bad that you're limiting the AI's abilities by doing that. I do have some dueling games that are going to show up on the top 10, but before I do that, two other categories. One is Brawling Games. One of these will end up on the top 10, so I won't mention it, but one is Arctic Scavengers. Arctic Scavengers is this brawling category are combats where a lot of people are involved, not just one-on-one. A lot of people are involved in the combat. In Arctic Scavengers, at the end of every round, players can save cards in their hand. It's a deck building game. They're saving cards in their hand and then revealing them for their total combat strength. And if you have the highest total, you get to dig through this kind of scrapyard deck to get what is typically... Actually, no, you don't dig through. I'm sorry. You get the top card of the deck that is generally a very powerful card. So winning the brawl is a big deal in Arctic Scavengers, but if you're holding back cards to do the brawl, then you're not using those cards. You're not spending those cards during your turn to do something else. But I like how elegant of a brawling mechanism it is, and how all players are involved in the brawl. Then the last category is kind of random. Just a bunch of games that I think have clever combat mechanisms but didn't make the top 10. One is Rise of Tribes. The thing that I like about Rise of Tribes, I don't actually even remember how the combat itself works, but I really like that multiple units in Rise of Tribes can occupy the same territory, but they don't actually attack each other unless they reach a certain threshold. So if it gets too crowded, then they end up attacking. But until that point, they just peacefully get along. I think that's really clever. Game of Thrones, the board game, has a combat mechanism that I think is you're revealing cards from your hand and getting rid of them, and then eventually you replenish your hand of cards. You have this hand of special cards, you're spending them in combat, and then eventually replenishing. And this is done, I'm not going to say better, but differently in another game that made my top 10. That's why this one is in the top 10. Rex has a really cool combat mechanism, but I've only played Rex once, so I didn't want to go into too much detail because I don't remember it all that much. But I know that it directly inspired the mechanism in Scythe, where you have a combat dial of sorts. You are associating a leader with it in Rex, and then fighting against the opponent. And there's a lot of asymmetry in Rex as well, more so than even in Scythe. I don't remember all the details of Rex. I thought it was pretty cool, though. I would highly recommend looking it up and learning more about that one. Seven Wonders. Seven Wonders has a very simple combat mechanism where every round you're just simply comparing yourself to the opponents on your left and right. I think that's really cool. It's so simple. There's no spite involved. You're not targeting a certain player at the table. You're just saying, okay, left and right, we're going to compare our military strengths. And I like how it escalates over the course of the game. So at the end of the first round, you're only getting one victory point and only losing one victory point if you win or lose combat. But the deeper the game goes, you're losing or gaining 3 points, or losing or gaining 5 points. I think that's really cool in Seven Wonders. Flick 'em Up is another one where, actually the first example on this list that I've mentioned, where dexterity matters. I haven't played Flick 'em Up, but I know that dexterity matters in combat in Flick 'em Up. I do have a different dexterity game that will make an appearance on my top 10. Root has combat. It's very simple. Asymmetry, I think, makes the combat in Root interesting, but I like how they chose a very simple combat mechanism in Root and built all the heavier aspects of the game around it, or around other aspects of the game. Rising Sun has a really cool combat mechanism that I think it was inspired by, and perhaps, in my opinion, done better by a different game that's on my top 10 list, so I won't go into that here. Forbidden Stars. Forbidden Stars is a game where combat can take like 15-20 minutes between two players. And it's a weird one. I alluded this at the beginning of the video. Forbidden Stars actually has a really cool combat system. It's been too long for me to even go into it in this video, but feel free to check it out. It's a really cool combat mechanism, but it also kind of leaves out the third and fourth player if you're playing 3 or 4 players for quite some time, which is the reason that I haven't returned to the game. But the combat itself, the game itself was just a dueling game, and it was just combat, like even just 3 combats. I think that would be a really cool game. But Forbidden Stars is a like 3 to 4 hour game, from my experience. And last, the game that probably should have been on my top 10, but I haven't played it in a while, is Adrenaline. Adrenaline has a really cool combat system where, and I don't remember all the details of it. I would highly recommend checking it out, though, because it's kind of like a Euro game that uses a lot of cool combat mechanisms. And it has some great incentives for not targeting weaker players and instead targeting stronger players. And it's almost like area control, or area majority, or majority for which opponents you've hit throughout the game. I don't remember all the details about it, but I just remember it being a really cool combat mechanism. In fact, if you search my channel for Adrenaline, I go into that mechanism on this channel. It's just been too long since I played it. All of that said, finally, let's get to the top 10. I'll try to keep this not too long here. So these aren't my top 10 favorite games that use combat. These are my top 10 favorite combat mechanisms in games. And number 10 is Cosmic Encounter. And the thing I really like about Cosmic Encounter, which ends up being just you're comparing 2 numbers, 2 strengths, both in terms of the units that you have on the board and a card that you're playing from your hand. But the thing I really like about it is that all players can potentially be involved in combat in ways that have repercussions throughout the rest of the game. So if two players say, okay, I'm going to go fight you, all other players can say, okay, I'm going to support player A or player B as part of this combat. And I love that. I love that all players can potentially be involved in combat and cosmic encounter. And that's why it's my number 10 combat mechanism in the tabletop game. Number 9 is one of the games that I own. Number 9 is Flipships. So this is the other dexterity game on the list. This is perhaps the only game on the list that's combat versus an AI. It's just an ongoing stream of ships. Here you can kind of see it on the back of the box, where these ships are just coming at you throughout the game and dealing damage to you if they get to a certain level. And you are flicking off the edge of the table to try to get your tokens on top of these ships to deal them damage. There are different rules about these ships. So like certain ships protect other ships. And I think there's a ship that actually, like, if you deal damage to it, it also damages ships around it. And you also have the mothership in the background. You're trying to flick things into this little box before the end of the game to destroy the mothership. And it's just a really cool AI system that is a lot of fun to fight against in a cooperative game. So that's Flipships, my number 9. My number 8 favorite combat mechanism deals a lot with spite, or not having spite, is King of Tokyo. Very simple combat in itself, in that you're just rolling dice, Yahtzee style. You can roll, then you can re-roll a couple times, and you look at the combat values on those dice. But it's who you're dealing damage to that I think is really interesting. In King of Tokyo, you're either the monster that's in Tokyo itself, or you're not in Tokyo. And if you're not in Tokyo, then you're not choosing which monster you're dealing damage to. Rather, you are always dealing damage to the monster that's in Tokyo. If you're in Tokyo, you deal damage. If you deal damage, you deal damage to all other monsters, all monsters that aren't in Tokyo. So I love this. It's taken all form of spite out of the game because you are not deciding who you're attacking. And it's very gratifying, a little scary, but gratifying to be in Tokyo and deal so much damage. You're dealing damage to everyone else at the table, but you know that they're all dealing damage to you as well. And there's a choice in King of Tokyo as players choose to attack you if you're going to stay in Tokyo or move back out. That's your choice in the game. Really, really cool system. I love that. This falls into pretty much the brawl category, even though players aren't making individual choices throughout combat. They're just making choices on their turn. But I really like that unspiteful system in King of Tokyo, my number 8 favorite combat mechanism in a tabletop game. My number 7 is Arcadia Quest. Now, I don't remember all the details about combat in Arcadia Quest. I've only played it once. I would recommend trying it. But the really cool thing in it are the exploding dice. Basically, there's a certain face on the dice that you're rolling in Arcadia Quest where if you roll it, you deal a damage and you get to roll that die again. And so going into any combat, whether you're attacking or someone else is attacking you, you have a chance. You have the chance that you could roll that exploding die and deal a damage and then roll again. And then maybe even do another damage and roll again. It makes it really exciting. And I really like the idea that in combat that you always feel like you have a chance. There's always hope that you can win, even when the odds are against you. And so that's why the exploding dice mechanism in Arcadia Quest is my number 7 favorite combat mechanism in a tabletop game. My number 6 is the siege mechanism in A Few Acres of Snow. The thing that I really love about this mechanism, and it's been a while since I played this game, but basically combat takes place over multiple turns, where it's this tug-of-war track where you are trying to pull the opponent or to push the opponent onto one side of the track. It's either a push or a pull. But it's not just a one-time deal. It's a tug-of-war track, and it really represents that feeling of a siege. It's not just one battle that matters, one fight, but a series of fights where you are slowly wearing down your opponent over multiple battles using this tug-of-war siege mechanism. I highly recommend checking out a video about that goes into more detail. It's been a little bit too long for me to go into big detail about it, but I remember loving that siege mechanism in the game. That's why that siege mechanism is my number 6 favorite combat mechanism in A Few Acres of Snow. Blood Rage is my number 5, or has my number 5 favorite combat mechanism, which is a draft that that turns into combat. Basically, in Blood Rage, you are drafting cards, and you are going to use those cards in combat during the next phase of each round. I love the draft. I love that it gives you information about what other players are acquiring, the other combat cards that they are acquiring. So I might see in my hand that I have a really tricky card that I can use in combat, and I have like a very powerful card. And so I know I have a choice there as to which one I keep, but I also know what I'm giving to my potential opponent and which card that they are likely to take. I also really like those tricky cards, particularly the Loki cards, specifically in that it is not always, depending on what you choose to draft, it's not always in your best interest to win combat. There might be a reason to actually lose combat using those Loki cards. I think that is really, really cool in Blood Rage, my number 5 game with my number 5 combat mechanism in a game. My number 4 favorite combat mechanism is the other game that I own, and that is Dice Throne. This is a dueling game involving dice. You're chucking lots of dice. And there are 2 things that I really like about combat in this game. One is the thing that I've always mentioned about Dice Throne, which is these mega abilities that you can have go off. So like the Pyromancer character has Scorch the Earth. So if you roll all 5 of your dice have a very specific face, then you deal a ton of damage. And it's so satisfying to trigger those giant abilities. I'd love to see that in another game. I might put that one of my games someday. But the other really cool thing about combat in Dice Throne is that the defender gets to do something. So when I attack you, I've rolled all my dice. I've decided, okay, I'm dealing this much damage to you. And then the defender has the chance to respond. They roll fewer dice typically, but they get something in return. They're going to maybe deflect some of the damage, they're going to gain some life back, or they're going to deal damage back to you. So both players are involved in combat in Dice Throne, but in very different ways. Attacking feels very different than defending. And so those are my favorite mechanisms, my number 4 favorite mechanisms in a game that has combat, Dice Throne. Number 3. This one caught me off guard, but I have to give credit to it. It's a game that I played a long time ago. I haven't played since. Tiny Epic Kingdoms has a really great combat mechanism, in my opinion. Basically, each player has a D12, a 12-sided die, and they are going to hide it behind their hand and choose one face of that die. And then they're going to reveal and compare those 2 faces with a few catches. One is that, and the higher number will win. So you're not rolling the die, you are placing it on the number that you want. One of the catches is that you must be able to pay resources equal to the number that you show. So if I show a 5, then I need to actually pay those resources. And I believe both players pay the resources in combat. So if you put a 2 on your die and I put a 5, we both have to pay those resources. I'm pretty sure. So I like that. I like that there's an expense to combat. You don't want to just show any random high number. You're picking a very specific number that you can afford to spend based on what you need, what other things you need those resources for. The other thing I really like about it is that the 12th face of the die, or maybe the first face, is a white flag, which just says, I'm not going to spend anything. And if we both show white flags, we just coexist. I love this, and it brings in a prisoner's dilemma element to a game, which I really would like to see in more combat games, especially dueling games, or not dueling games, non-dueling games that have one-on-one combat, where you can potentially say in Tiny Epic Kingdoms, you can say to the opponent, let's just share this territory. Let's get along. I'm going to put a white flag down. And the opponent might say, okay, yeah, sure, I'll agree. But then when you reveal, do you actually do that? Do you actually, were you bluffing or not? I love that table talk added element and that feeling of being a little mischievous and negotiation and the repercussions that might arise from actually lying to an opponent when you do that. I'd love to see more prisoner's dilemma mechanisms in combat in games. And so that's my number 3, combat in Tiny Epic Kingdoms. My number 2 is Cry Havoc. Cry Havoc, again, another game that I don't play these combat games a lot, but I still respect them and really enjoy them when I do. In Cry Havoc, whenever there's combat in the territory, you pull all your units off that territory, and then you place them on a combat board on one of 3 different slots. And then you compare units, and then you can play some cards to move around those units to boost their abilities. And then in each of those categories, you compare your units to the opponent. One category, and this is the game that's kind of like Rising Sun. This one I think inspired the combat mechanism in Rising Sun. One of the little mini battles that happen on this board determines who controls the territory. So if you have more units than your opponent, you end up controlling the territory. There's another category of prisoners of war, essentially. You can take prisoners if you have more units than your opponent in that category. And the last category are, and actually it's not always comparison. I think you just take the prisoners immediately. And the last category is how many units you're actually going to kill. So you're determining how many units actually survive the battle. I'm not describing it very well here, so I would recommend watching like another video about the combat mechanism in Cry Havoc. It's really, really cool. I think even I have a video about it, so if you search for Cry Havoc on my channel, you should probably see it. That's number 2, Cry Havoc. My number 1, Kemet. I love the combat mechanism in Kemet. It does everything that I want in combat. It's fast. You have full agency over what you're doing, but a little bit of uncertainty about what your opponent is doing. There's table talk in it, and basically in Kemet, I should describe it first. You are comparing your combat strength to your opponent's, but you're also potentially hiding little sneaky combat cards behind bigger cards that you're playing. So the bigger cards, everyone has the same cards, and you always have to choose one and discard another. So you're cycling through this deck. You have information about what your opponent has already played, and those cards do things like in Cry Havoc, where they determine how many units, who's actually going to win combat versus like how many units are going to die, and there's a defensive stat too on those cards. So there's that. And then if you lose combat, your units kind of die, but you also gain resources from them. So it's very easy to bring those units back onto the board. You're never really beaten down in combat in a way that you can't come back from very quickly. And also combat can be enhanced by the units and other things that you gain during the game. So you can boost your combat abilities through a number of different things that you have control over. I'd recommend watching a video again about Kemet. Kemet's combat mechanism is really, really cool. Yeah, it's my favorite. It's my favorite combat mechanism in a tabletop game. That's my number 1. Long video today. Thanks for sticking with me if you decided to stick through all this. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on games that I've mentioned, on combat mechanisms that I haven't mentioned. What are your favorite combat mechanisms in tabletop games? Or even talk about video games, especially if we can learn from them as tabletop game designers. I'd love to hear about that as well. Thanks.